Good afternoon. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk, which is a program of Muslim Network TV. We're also seen live on Facebook and on YouTube, which is a program of Muslim. We are having a bit of sadness today as all of us around the country watch what is happening with the grand jury in the case of Breonna Taylor. We're also still in mourning over George Floyd and Jacob Blake and too many to name. So today, even though we're going to start our program investigating a similar but another set of issues and looking at a Sufi mystery novel, which is unusual in and of itself. And we're going to dovetail that with a book on polygyny. We're going to come back to our thoughts on what's happening right at our feet. So today I have with me Professor Debra Majeed, who is an emerita at Beloit College and a widely known lecturer on issues of women and gender and also sexuality. We also have with us the author of A Lover, a Sufi Mystery, with Laury Silver, who was a lecturer on Islam, Sufism, and gender at Skidmore College and the University of Toronto. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me provide a little bit of background on The Lover. You know, I see this title. Nobody's told me anything about it. I'm saying, really? Oh, this has got to be delicious. So I grabbed the book, and it took me a minute to realize that I was in 9th century Baghdad. Because it could have been down the street, you know, for all intents and purposes. But it took me a moment to realize where I was. And then, of course, the prose and the style really captured me. And I have to admit, I got so mad at the protagonist that I put the book down for a minute because I was ready to just strangle her. And it's like, why don't you fall in love with this dude? But I don't want to tell the story before the story is told.
Yeah.
So, Laury, if you could just give us an overview of The Lover. And for our listeners and viewers, this is the first of a set of Sufi mysteries set around the same time in Baghdad. And trust me, you will get as mad at the people in the second set as you were with the people in the first set. But it is interesting because it's this wonderful fiction. Go ahead, please, Laury. Tell us about The Lover.
This is a set of 4 mysteries. I've always really loved murder mysteries. So it's I wanted to explore themes that are important to us as Muslims today. I wanted to think particularly about how we remember the past, and how we remember the past has everything to do with how we are Muslims in the present. Whether we idealize the past or we see the diversity of practice and people in the past, what kinds of texts we highlight, those that we don't. And so much of my scholarship when I was a working academic had to do with recovering lost voices that had been left out of the major sources that come through these sort of elite channels within the tradition. And as I left academia, I still had this urge to talk about these things and share these things. And because being an educator was always primary for me, teaching, I thought that writing about it in fiction would be a wonderful way to bring these ideas across, and putting it in the context of a murder mystery allows people to act in all sorts of important and emotional and difficult ways that can frustrate us and make us want to smack them and do things, because it's sort of because you have the pressure of having to solve a crime that's in it, and allows us to ask questions about love and justice, so many things that are important to us. But I also really badly wanted to tell a story about the spiritual growth of one woman through her trauma, from the moment of her spiritual crisis, which is the first book, The Lover. And each book is named after a name of God that was in use at the time. So The Lover, through all the way to the end, the last book will be a salam, it'll be the peace, because it will be about her finally having reached the soul at peace with God. So the second book...
God. I can't, because then I don't have to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give anything away about the romance, but she's got a lot of work to do, right? And it's going to take her 4 books to do the work that she's got to do. So the second book...
Interrupt you here and take you back a little bit. Many of us academics, and Debra can attest to this, you get into one style of writing. You got to do the research, you got to have citations forever. And also, we all read a lot of fiction, but the crossover between nonfiction and fiction, and I'm guessing because I peeked at my husband one time doing something, a storyboard, because we have a storyboard of sorts, but it's a storyboard that's more in the shape of an outline, to make sure you don't miss anything, make sure you got your citation the same way. How do you make that switch?
And can I just, Laury, could I just add on to this?
Please.
Talk specifically about historical fiction, because this is what you say you're doing in this novel.
Yeah. So it's, it's part of the scary part of it is that I decided I was going to historical fiction doesn't necessarily have to be accurate. A lot of historical fiction, the background texture is a historical moment, but that doesn't necessarily mean the things that happen in it are things that actually happened. And there can be all sorts of anachronisms in the way people act and speak. There's a broad range of how historical fiction works. But I wanted these to be very accurate. I wanted to do everything except for use the footnotes, right? And I also wanted to make...
I understand that one.
Yeah, I'm so over footnotes at this point. And I really... and I wanted to make arguments that, frankly, I couldn't make in an academic book. I had things I wanted to say that I would never have had the ability to argue, because I simply just didn't have the preponderance of evidence that I would need to get past something. And so, but I wanted to say what I've been thinking all this time. Now, I think part of why this worked for me is because I do social history, mainly within Sufism. And so I'm thinking about the lives of the people. So my very first article was about teaching methods in early Sufi groups. And I was reading these sayings by these early Sufis about what they would say or do in a teaching situation, the advice that they were giving. And typically people read those as sort of rarefied advice given on high or from a lecture. And I was seeing them in my mind as people sitting in a community with other people speaking to them. And I was seeing them as in a lived environment. And that informed the way I researched and wrote about it. And so since that point, I've always tried to investigate the social conditions, assuming that social conditions have everything to do with how a person is expressing their love of God, how a person, why do women talk about God, loving God one way? And why does one woman in one city talk about loving God as this desperate act over which she has no control, and another woman talking about loving God in this intimate way in which she does have control? Well, as it turns out, the two cities had very different theological norms. One was very focused on predestination, and the other one on free will. So they articulated their love of God differently, but they both talked about God as a lover, which, and in a way different from how men talked about God as a lover. So God was this masculine husband in a way who was going to protect them and care for them and be jealous the way that men are jealous So it's an interesting thing. So I always looked at these things which involved, just thinking about them as people. How does, the fact that men often stay up all night long in prayer worshiping. Well, can a woman with children do that? Can a woman who's enslaved do that? No, they can't. So then what does their worship look like? And how does it affect, how do their lives affect the kinds of things they say and the worship that they have? So that put me in this position of imagining lives. And I always, whenever I would read these stories about these amazing mystic women who were tough as nails, right? I always used to think, well, what would it be like to be their child? What would it be like to be the child of a woman like this? And some of them, one woman, she didn't curse God, but she had a few words with God when she got pregnant. Because she's just like, I thought you loved me, and now you've given me a baby to distract me from my love of you, right? And so some women.
Let me butt in here.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask the question of Debra. Well, two questions actually. One is, I hate women being mules, and I don't admire being a mule, nor being tough as nails. I think you should just be human, but that's just me. On the second thing of women giving themselves over to an unseen being, isn't that a way, or have you found it to be a way of women compensating for what some perception of what they can have in this world, or what they don't think they can have?
Debra, do you want to speak to that?
You start. It's your book.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, but you got to hear the book. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was trying to represent the women as I understand them through the sources, but also to a lot of the women that I've known, and how we over the years have dealt with our trauma and dealt with the way in which we understood God's will over our own lives. And how do we come to move beyond the things that have happened to us when God is the one who willed these things. So I was sort of thinking in that context. And the women of this time, they show an array of experiences. I can't think of any of the women from that period who articulated their relationship with God that way. So I wasn't looking at that, but that would make a great character, and you may end up showing up in the fourth book if you're not careful.
No, go ahead.
Debra, please.
No, I was going to say it is an interesting question. Of course, we can't presume that all women approach God or divine power in the same way. And the realization is, at least from my research, is that some women are trying to overcompensate or to fill a gap in the worldly sphere. But for others, they're going beyond that. And that this force of power is kind of, I don't want to say pushed to the side, but given a separate place in another room, so that the action and agency of the subject can go on without any concern for anyone else. And then you have those women for which any othering of an other is unimportant. And so for them, as long as their moral code is acceptable, what they do or don't do, how they perceive themselves, is not the business of God.
Yeah, but you have, and I don't think this is a spoiler alert because I know everybody's going to run and get this book. You have this woman, she doesn't eat. She doesn't care about her appearance. How come, or why, and you can answer this after we take our first little break, why, to be in love with God, do you have to be uncaring about yourself and starving to death and don't comb your hair and don't change your clothes?
Yeah.
We'll come back in a moment. Oh, Katie. I can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me
Yep.
now? Okay, so this is Zaytuna's starting point. And Junaid, who the great Sufi Sheikh Junaid, is actually trying to get her, and Nouri, the great Sufi Sheikh Nouri, they're actually trying to get her to leave that life behind for a life of love, and for a life in which she has a more moderate path. And she's at this starting point because her mother was this enormous, extraordinary, famous mystic, and she wants to be like her mother, but she doesn't seem to have a taste for or a genius for love or ecstasy. So she beats herself up with this kind of asceticism, which was common at that period of time, in order to try to reach her mother's height and to be like her mother, but she never can be if she does it that way. And this is a point in time in history in which mystics were sort of leaving behind a sharp asceticism for a more love-based Sufism. So her journey also reflects the development of mysticism at that period of time as well, away from this excessive asceticism to a deeper love-based mysticism that also included a more moderate lifestyle, which included marriage and eating.
And combing your hair.
And combing your hair. Yeah, and
What
combing
did
your
you
hair.
think, Debra?
I'm sorry?
What did you think of Zaytuna?
Well, I appreciated that characterization. I was wondering, though, in the process, when Laury, you talked about on your website that you wanted to raise voices that were lost and nearly lost in history. I wanted to ask, when we think about Zaytuna, what voice does she represent? And how and in what way did you choose her among other voices? I mean, why did we get her? I'm interested. I'm glad that she was a Black woman. And I know that there were many Black Sufi women, but what was it about her? Because we do get this sense of a marginalized, a self-annihilating persona that is typical of some depictions of Black women today.
Right.
So of course, you're not trying to codify that.
No.
And that we'll see her quote unquote liberation sometime down the line, right? So specifically, what was it about her that you wanted, that represented a voice you wanted to tell? And what voices were you trying to raise? And then my third and final question in this segment, how is it that you as a white woman felt comfortable raising, drawing, contrasting this particular voice?
Yeah, so I started out, it's really her mother that I started out with. So Zaytuna ended up becoming a Black woman because I ended up deciding to base her mother on the Black mystic women who had been erased from the sources. Mm-hmm. And so once I had a choice. She could be Arab, Persian, or African descent. These were the three options for me. And you know, her mother, who is this rich, luscious, strong mystic who was not, you know, she's not starving herself to death. She's a woman of extraordinary power and extraordinary knowledge of God who is teaching others. And this is the mother who she wants to become, but who she lost at a young age. And so she had a difficult time with her childhood. But so I started with the mom, and now, yeah, I could have made her Arab and I could have made her Persian, but why? Why would I choose Arab or Persian? Mm-hmm. Right. So why would I center an Arab or a Persian woman at the center of a story when I could center a Black woman? When I could center a Black woman at the center of a story of Islam, right?
So Black lives were mattering then, you're trying to suggest
Black lives were mattering. I mean, because one of the things that you know as academics, right, is how the Black experience of Islam in the academic is not, this is not something we hear a lot within academic circles, right? Very little. And then this is also something that we all know is not centered in our religious lives either, in our mosques, you know, and in our communities. And the kind of this. So why would I choose an Arab or a Persian woman, right? So and the other thing is that I realized is that if I center a Black female saint, their mother, right? If I center this woman, if I make this woman a Black female saint, then I have the possibility in fiction of entering into people's imaginations in a way that when they think the word saint, they might think a Black woman instead of thinking Rabia. So how can I, I had these tools for me. I had these, so this is partly answering the third part of your question as well, is that, I have these tools, I have these things that I can bring. And why would I not bring them in a way that would, to my mind, serve a purpose that is necessary, that needs to be served both in the academy and within our community and in readers. Fiction has this extraordinary power to get things across and to enter into people's minds and their souls and their memories. And since these books really are about the act of remembering, how often do we, when we remember through the sources that we read in, in school, in the mosque, everywhere, remember Black voices? It's like, oh, right. It's like, oh, Bilal, and then the conversation's over, so we need to, so I really wanted to, I had this capacity to do this because the sources that I worked with, and I wanted to bring that in. So then once I picked her, then I realized my main character, so the mom is not the main character, right? So then all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, I'm a white person with two main characters who are Black. How am I going to do this? And so at that point, I reached out to a bunch of friends and people, and specifically Michael Mumisa, who's a specialist of Muslims of African descent in that period. And I spoke to people about it. How do I do this? What do I do? And everybody was encouraging and gave me advice. And I just basically listened to everybody. And the people who advised me, they actually had veto power on what I wrote and did not write. And I would work with them on these characterizations and send them selections, and they would read them and say, no, do this, don't do that. And I would do what they said. I made the assumption that they probably understood Blackness better than I did. And so I tried to, listen in that way and then reflect those changes within the sources. Michael Mumisa was most important for the first one because, I had to think, well, what's their culture? So Zaytuna and Teen, how do they act in this world? And he said, well, they would have been culturally Arab, but there would have been objects that they would have that would link them to their African heritage. And then there would be the tensions that they would feel in an Arab world in which Blackness was seen negatively. There was a lot of racism against people with darker skin at that point in time. Even it's very interesting. I mean, maybe we can get into this at a certain point, the way Blackness was constructed then. But so then how do I get them in these situations? How much? Because Zaytuna looks like her Arab father, her biological father, and Teen looks like the mother. So their experiences differ in how they live through this Arab Persian dominant world.
Hold on one second. Debra had a question a little bit ago. Get it in.
Yeah, so you said you started off at the top of the show talking about you used historical fiction as a genre because it allowed you to say things you couldn't say elsewhere or to make arguments that you couldn't make. With Zaytuna and female Blackness or just Blackness in general, what argument were you trying to make?
So Zaytuna, I mean, to be honest, Zaytuna for me is a character that I hope everybody can relate to because of the way in which I was thinking about Zaytuna more in terms of her womanness and the way in which she as a woman is affected by things that happen to her in the world and her relationship with God and loving God, wanting to love God, wanting to be in a relationship with God and having to sort of understand her trauma. So the whole time since I've been Muslim, I've been hearing stories and having my own story about the difficulties that we've experienced at the hands of men, at the hands of society in other ways, and how we all juggle that with our Islam and juggle that with our relationship with God. Zaytuna, that was my major concern with Zaytuna, but that's going to show up in racialized context. So her main story was not about her Blackness. It was about her trauma and her overcoming trauma through these 4 books. to be a soul at peace with God, and how to do that. But you know, one of the things that people say when you're a white person writing Black characters is that their Blackness can't be the center point of their characterization. It is obviously going to be there in the story, but something else has to be part of the story. So I did that by accident. That wasn't, so I hadn't heard that at that time. I wasn't sort of hooked into writers at this point, or conversations about who can write what. And so sort of by accident at that point, I created this woman that I hoped we could all identify with. And one of the things that I find so moving is so many people will write me and say, you know, I saw my own struggles with God in her, you know, and this is, and so I'm hoping that they can, with their own hearts, move with Zaytuna's heart through these difficulties to another side.
Before we go on a break, Debra, let me give you a last word.
I want to come back and talk about what you gave up by choosing this genre. I know that very few people would look at the name of this text or the cover of the book and think that they're going to find stories about Black people.
Yeah.
So
and I want to ask about your little barbs and hadith. So let us take a break now, and we will be back shortly. Are you on break? People think this is a book. Unlock her. Okay, Debra posed some extraordinary questions. Let me ask Laury to be a little brief in her answers. We got to get to a whole bunch of stuff, and I still want to get to exploring how texts were treated, how sheikhs, I'm so tired of sheikhs, but anyway, how sheikhs were treated, how people get in positions of power, you know, and maintain them, and even the nepotism that goes on. Go ahead.
So I wanted to say that Zaytuna's not the only character going through spiritual growth. So she's paired with the Shia cop. So Amar, the Shia cop, is her pair, and the two of them are traveling this 4-stage path together, but he's doing it in a specifically Shia way. And so really at the center of this book, we see each one of them going through the same exact things in each book, but in their own way. And so at the center of the book is coming to terms with God, and coming to terms with the names of God and how the names of gods are manifest through us and how we encounter God. So the title of the book are names of God, because God really was my focus for the books. And how we as people, all the characters are all going through their own journeys. But so how do we as people in our journeys, and Teen in the second book is understanding what it means to be a man. All the men in the book are showing different sides of masculinity within that context. And so God really is at the center. So I wanted the name of God to be at the center and on the covers, and partially the limitations of covers. I know this sounds crazy, but I'm limited by what I was allowed to do on the Amazon Cover Create. So because I self-published these, I used their software, and I asked an Iraqi calligrapher. I hired an Iraqi calligrapher to create that first cover, and then I used that piece of calligraphy, that digital calligraphy, as the background picture, because I wanted to settle it back in Baghdad, and I wanted to center God's name in it.
So I know that this isn't a Black book, okay? You do have main characters who are Black in it. So during this period of time, we're talking about loving God. How do we love a God who allows slavery? How do you address that in the text?
Yeah, so this is a big question of how do you come to love God? And so in this context, so I'm not going to say that for us right now. I can't answer that question for people, certainly myself. In this particular period of time, for these particular characters, it's coming to understand God's will on a level that's higher than this world. So it's holding justice in one hand and acceptance of divine will in the other. And so partly one of the things that a mystery novel allows you to do is allows characters to seek justice and to talk about the necessity of seeking justice. And so how do we seek justice and accept God's will? So there's an idea, and this is one of the things that I was addressing, and that a lot of contemporary Muslim teachers say now, is that we should be passive with respect to God's justice. We should not be seeking justice. We should be passive because of God's will. When in fact,
beautiful hold on to,
we should not do that.
Back to Breonna Taylor. But let me ask you about in the book.
But I want to say one last thing. In that period of time, they were not doing that. So there was a disagreement. There was rife disagreement over what you do with seeking justice, whether or not how you seek justice and what you do with regard to God. But anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Okay, let me get to what you do with hadith, where you have what's put out on the rumor mill is that this man has taken the hadith of somebody else, scratched out their name essentially, and put his name in their place, which I think is highly probable. But also that you have to consider the history of hadith and in any religious tradition, how things are passed along, what's remembered and what's not, how context of those things are passed along. And I thought that was just an awesome a thing for people to try to investigate. My last question right this minute is, I'm interested in how this gender stuff, how this in fiction, this kind of demoralization, ignoring of second-class citizen of women is put into a place. And even within the Sufi community, they're still not sheikhs. They are women who are giving up a whole bunch of stuff, which makes the young person critical. You mean I got to go hungry, not wash my hair, be reminded to wash my body? I can't do this, that, or the other to seek God? Really?
So two things. One, I wanted to show the diversity of experience of hadith, and so I just picked Hanbali hadith scholars so that I could look at the diversity of kinds of hadith scholars that there were, the diversity of their intentions, the diversity of the ways in which they handle the source text that they're working with. And so you have everybody who, from very unpleasant people to that gentle man who takes his turban off and trades it with Mustafa. And the story about the scratching of the thing, it's interesting. It's actually from medieval Baghdad. Somebody tried to frame someone in the medieval period by doing this and ruin his reputation by saying that he had done that. So I took that from a historical document.
Right.
But that did actually, but the guy didn't actually do it. He was being framed in order to ruin his reputation. So on the gender thing, one of the things that was really important to me was to show people in this book that women were sheikhas at this period of time, right? We were just beginning the period where they stop. So where women stop being official teachers. In the early period, there were women who would preach in the streets and preach in the graveyards and preach in people's homes. These mystics that their mother is based on, right? She's sort of the archetype of these women who taught all the time, and mixed gender environments. Men and women were going, children were going, men were constantly seeing women and going to women as teachers and saw women as their teachers. And so this whole sort of sheikh system really happens around the year 1000. So the time of this book, the idea was that anybody who was your teacher was your sheikh, and that you should see multiple teachers all the time. There weren't any Sufi orders at this point. You saw whoever you saw.
So, Debra, how does that inform your inquiries about gender in Islam? I mean, the women are back in, 11th century now. They don't get to be sheikhs.
Well, we know that there's been a period in which our agency has not only been dismissed, but rendered invisible. So the fact that we have Muslim women's movements that occurred particularly in the 19th and 20th century are trying to not only restart that, but re-envision what agency is, and to show people like me who come to Islam in the late 20th century that there's a role that I can play, that my perceptions of what I have been taught or what's historically understood about Islam and about God in relations to women may not be the truth, because we have a period of history that has been dismissed and are rendered invisible.
And hidden. And that's what was so important. And I hope viewers and listeners go get these books. I want everybody to be as mad as this woman as I was. But the other thing is for young women who are trying to come to terms with what they're being told about Islam. On the one hand, you have the good woman. What does she do? Well, she cooks and cleans and takes care of kids, right? And her relationship with God is private, and it's not seen or understood by anybody. Then you see women in other religious traditions, and I'm not saying that they're having a ball, but they have celebratory ways of communing that are not present in Islam. You know, I mean, I remember back in the 70s, you could go past the masjid, and if there was a church next door and they start playing some gospel music, all the toes would start patting in the masjid, right? When they were supposed to be being still, you know, you get this straitjacket of a faith tradition where there's no love, there's no communing, there's no pop.
Yep.
And so what do women do? They had their boobas kicked in the 11th century, 9th century, whatever century Baghdad is. And they're still getting them kicked in the 21st century. What to do?
I guess for me, what I was hoping these books would do would be to show everybody that things were different back in the day. And typically when we sit with our Muslim teachers today, they tell us that things were that women were quiet, that women were not teachers, and if they were teachers, they were teachers in very private contexts. All this.
Well,
They tell us
women still sitting there. They
So,
don't have the agency to giddy up.
Well, so what I want to say is that, they think that this is the case, and back then it wasn't. And I want to show through this fiction that it wasn't the case, that we have a history that you could remember differently to create a different kind of present now. I think people are too enamored of authority, and they just follow authority these days, right?
Yeah, but what goes on in the mosque is not one's entire life. And I think that I know women in our mosque who come for prayer, who will sit under an imam, male typically, but recognize that that is a battle, but there are other battles on different fronts that she wants to fight now. And so choosing one's battle, there are women who are starting women's only masjids. There are women, as we know, who are preaching khutbahs and delivering Juma all across the world. Yeah. So it's a matter of not suggesting that even our trials or our struggles are not monolithic.
Yeah.
And that women choose their battles for various reasons, but we're all across the world doing a number of things. And hopefully all leading to a sense of liberation for the next generation. Fighting battles that our grandchildren won't have to fight.
When you think there was a poll saying that only 20% of Muslims go to the mosque, in North America, then what are the rest of what's everybody else doing?
Except be behind something or over in another building. I mean, what you gonna do when you get there?
Yeah.
Besides listen to somebody else's children. I have to frankly say, I mean, the pandemic has brought some wonderful things.
Yeah, but there are women who are deciding, number one, they may not go. Number two, they're going to change the structure. They're going to be the president of the Shura board. And they're going to let people know that if we were all to depart from this particular masjid, you wouldn't have one. So we're going to put our voices in some political and social spaces. So let's not suggest that all women are just sitting there being mute. But there are women who are very active and making their voices heard and changing structures that aren't as visible because we don't have attention to, particularly during this pandemic period, we don't have attention to what women are doing grassroots mobilization that's going on.
I would suggest that, and this is not because I have a bunch of sites, that African American communities, the men in those communities are finding that African American women have voice. I think in many of the immigrant communities, many things have remained the same, but they're beginning to change. In that people can do Zoom meetings, they can do all kinds of things. But I think that there is still a fear of being disconnected from family. Threats of disinheritance, the threats of this, that, and the other that are still on women, which is why I found this book so enthralling. One of the reasons was, despite the what happens to lower class women, where you're never given an opportunity to speak, you're discouraged from speaking, you lack self-esteem and self-confidence because you haven't been in spaces, Zaytuna persists. She feels compelled to persist. And I think as more read it and we come back to it, we have to try to understand, and we're going to talk about that in the very last segment of the show. This justice in the after you drop dead is one kind. Justice in the here and now is another. Really looking at whether or not it's justice and how we see justice, because justice doesn't necessarily play favorites.
Right.
Okay. I think that deserves some of these wonderful kind of deliberations that we're giving Zaytuna. And because I know there's a book 4, I will give up on choking her. Um, and I can see one of the things before we take another break, however, is we haven't talked about Sufi, Sunni, and Shi ways of being,
Mm-hmm.
or of understanding themselves as Muslims, and that you can be Sunni or Shi and still be Sufi,
Mm-hmm.
or you can be Sufi and decide not to be anyone.
Mm-hmm.
You can be me and decide it's hard enough to just be Muslim, and the rest of you all can take your histories and tuck them in various places. Um, so let's take a break now.
Okay.
I want to leave a good section for us to just give some definitional service to that. But I also want to take what we've learned and go to Breonna Taylor. Especially, does look like it, does she?
And that hair.
Okay, we are back, and I'm still worried about this justice after you die and some sense of justice here. I don't know what that was. But I also know that the cultures that understand that are usually oppressed cultures. That I can't do anything about the injustices that I'm experiencing, except move myself out of the way and pray that, something doesn't happen to me when I move myself out of the way. Women do that often.
Too
And, huh?
Too often.
Yeah. But we are, and I just realized the time, someone move it along, confronted with the issues of Breonna Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
One central issue is justice. And as Muslims, we know that justice doesn't play favorites, but that there is justice promotes the sense of accountability and responsibility. We have police who have not been held accountable, except one man who was fired, but largely not held accountable or responsible for actions outside of their normal duties. And we have, and I don't know if you put this responsibility on the other end. Islamically, there is a thing as a blood payment,
Mm-hmm.
where what has happened here is $12 million has been paid to her family for the blood life that was taken,
Mm-hmm.
but there is no accompanying justice.
Accountability. Yeah.
So would each of you take a minute, a quick minute, 30 seconds or so to speak to that? Because we're all in havoc.
Mm-hmm. Laura, you want to go first? Or you want me?
I'll just say, you know, from where I stand as a white person and as a Muslim and a Sufi oriented Muslim, what we've been taught to do, like you know, I have a sheikh. My sheikh taught us to do is to realize that we would, all of us, do the same thing to another person. That given the opportunity in the depths and darknesses of our own nafs, that, as he said, don't think you wouldn't put a knee on a man's neck. You need to confront that in your own soul. And then you need to bring that confrontation from your own soul to your communities to work with other people to transform. And don't think that you're better than that, so that you can transform yourself, so that when you go into your community, you can transform the people who you can touch within.
Okay, Deborah?
I'm angry on a number of levels, and I'm glad I'm not living in Louisville right now, to be honest. And I want to lift up her family and all of the families and survivals of many Black people, men and women and children, who have died at the hands of police, have died of acts of violence. And was privileged to sign a statement just today that Muslim advocates, a civil rights American Muslim organization, issued. And among its demands, I just want to name three that I particularly want to support, and that is establish a federal standard that use of force be reserved as a last resort, eliminate government programs that provide military equipment to law enforcement, prohibit the use of no-knock warrants, although there is a debate about or controversy whether this actually was. And finally, my fourth one I'm adding, lower the legal standard to make it easier for prosecutors to successfully hold law enforcement accountable. And we need some national standards, not just local standards, but national standards, so that no matter where a Black person travels, one can expect justice, and that justice be something one familiar with, regardless of where he or she travels.
Well, let me just say, as our parting thing, and for those viewers, listeners, and Deborah and Laury, if you're available, we're going to have Jacob Blake Sr. on the program on October 1st. And I hope both of you join us. I think it's the persistence of the trauma, you know, and we're worn out, which doesn't lend itself toward introspection. You know, it keeps the anger boiling and stuff, and whatever rational information we can bring, it's hard to bring that rational stuff. I like the list that you came up with and your addition of one. I think we do have to go back and look at who the police are, what their jobs are. Their jobs are very difficult under any circumstances, because we have citizens who lie, cheat, and steal and hide. And just as there's a code of loyalty among the police, there's a code of loyalty among the people in the streets. And the two only meet, it seems to me, at a barrel of a gun.
And we need to vote. We need to vote in our down ballot races for judges and commissioners of labor and agriculture and Senate and other positions where we can get in people where we could elect people who would have good moral values and our concerns in place. We need
there are a lot of Senate seats up for grabs. There are park commissioners. There are there are judges. There are all kinds of levels at which we can, as citizens, can use our power to vote. And like something Laury said about those imams who are deciding back away from it,
Mhm.
have no order in it, they need to go live somewhere else because that has not served them well.
We issued in Charlotte, we issued an election guide in which we contacted candidates in 15 races. And we heard back from 9 on questions that Muslims had about issues concerning them. One candidate standing for election today does not see that Islam and democracy are compatible.
Mm,
Folks need to know that,
yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So we need to do our investigation of the candidates and not just be concerned about who's leading the top of the ticket, because it's the lower part of the ticket that's really going to impact
Yeah,
the most.
but on the other side,
Yeah,
some Muslim quarters, their utterances may
yeah,
make it seem like
yeah.
Islam is not compatible with democracy.
Mhm.
So we
True.
have 2 jobs to do.
Yes,
I
that
think
is
one,
Mhm.
I was going to say, I think one of the problems that we have facing Black Lives Matter within our community is the anti-Black racism in the Muslim community, which is led by a lot of teachers and people. I see a lot of this on Twitter. There's and I hear a lot of this stuff that that I didn't see so much because I'm typically very isolated. But since I've had to be out in social media because of the books, and people who are arguing for this kind of social passivity, and who specifically, and I mean this, and specifically speak about the past, speak about slavery in the past, speak and make and romanticize slavery in the past, and romanticize the position of people of African heritage in the Muslim community without speaking to the difficulties, so that people don't have to believe that Black people in North America are facing trouble that requires their companionship in the struggle. And
Well,
that's what I see.
that's why I was pushing that book past. You can't expect companionship from people who are of different castes. You
Mhm.
can't expect it. What you can demand, however, is they get their foot off your neck.
Mhm.
So let me say that this has been extraordinary. Um,
Thank you, Laurie.
Thank
I am
you.
enjoying my book tables now. I was a little hesitant, but book tables are great, and I may have the 2 of you on talking with another author. Never can tell. This has been extraordinary. We've had Professor Debra Majeed and Professor Laury Silver, and we're looking at the themes in her text, The Lover. And don't let the title fool you. Lots of drama and goodies going on there. And hopefully all of you will read it and will contact her. Her contact information is on Amazon.com. And also read Debra Majeed's book on polygyny, which kind of crosses with some of the themes we found in The Lover. Thank you all. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk. See you again tomorrow.
Thank you, Amina. Assalamu
Thank
alaikum.
you.
Bye.
Well,
Oh,